The day my stepmother handed me a garbage bag and told me to be gone before dinner, I didn't cry. I think that surprised her. I was 23 years old, standing in the front hallway of the house I'd grown up in, holding everything I apparently owned. A few shirts, my dad's old hunting knife, and a photograph I'd grabbed off my dresser without even looking at it. My stepmother stood at the top of the stairs, with her arms crossed and her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, watching me with the expression of someone who'd finally finished a long and tedious errand. My half-brother stood behind her, a little to the left, looking at his phone. My father had been dead for 11 days. "The will was clear," she said. It was the third time she'd said it that morning. I didn't argue. I didn't have the energy, and honestly, I didn't know enough to argue. I was still sleeping 4 hours a night and forgetting to eat. I'd spent the first week after the funeral sitting in my dad's workshop out back, just breathing in the smell of sawdust and machine oil, trying to hold on to something. Now I was being handed a garbage bag and told to go hold on to something somewhere else. I walked out the front door. I heard it close behind me. Not a slam, which almost would have been better. Just a soft final click. I sat in my truck in the drive for a long time. It was February in Alberta and the kind of cold that makes your nose hurt when you breathe. I had $340 in my checking account. I had a half tank of gas. I had no idea where I was going. My dad had built that company from nothing. 22 years of early mornings and frozen job sites and handshake deals that somehow always held. By the time he got sick, Hargrove Contracting had 17 full-time employees, a yard full of equipment, and a reputation across 3 counties that most people spend a lifetime trying to earn. He'd raised me on that company. I used to do my homework on the tailgate of his truck while he finished estimates. I knew how to read a site plan before I knew how to drive. And then he married her, 8 years ago. I was 15, my older sister Nora was 17, and we both understood even then that something had shifted. My dad was in love, genuinely, embarrassingly in love. And her name was Diane, and she had a son named Kyle who was 16 and already good at everything I wasn't. Kyle was clean-cut and polite and remembered to shake hands. I was the one who tracked mud into the house and argued about curfews. I never thought she was evil. I want to be honest about that. I just thought she didn't particularly like me, which is different. I thought my dad saw it and felt caught in the middle and didn't know what to do about it, which is also different. I thought it was just one of those complicated family situations that never fully resolves, but eventually everyone learns to tolerate. I didn't think she would hand me a garbage bag 11 days after he died. The will, as she had told me, was clear. The company and the house and the accounts went to her, in full, to be managed with consideration for the family going forward. My sister Nora got a small cash amount. I got my dad's personal tools. His truck, which I was currently sitting in, was technically still in his name, and Diane had mentioned twice already that we'd need to sort that out. I didn't know, sitting there in that driveway with the heater running and my garbage bag in the back seat, that the will she was referring to was not my father's real will. I didn't know a lot of things yet. I drove to my buddy Garrett's place because I didn't have anywhere else to go. Garrett lived in a basement suite in Red Deer and worked at a parts counter and had a couch that smelled like dog even though he didn't own a dog. He didn't ask a lot of questions. He made me a grilled cheese and turned on the hockey game, and that was enough. I slept on that couch for 2 weeks. I picked up some shifts at a warehouse outside the city. The kind of work where your body shuts down your brain for 8 hours, which was exactly what I needed. I called Nora twice, but she was dealing with her own grief and her own anger, and we mostly just sat on the phone saying things like "I know" and "yeah" until one of us had to go. I tried not to think about the company. I tried not to think about my dad's handwriting on the whiteboard in the shop, where he'd written a punch list for a job they were still finishing when he got sick, and no one had erased it. I tried not to think about the fact that I had spent the last 4 years working for Hargrove Contracting for a salary that my dad had always said would even out later, and that later had apparently arrived and been distributed to someone else. I was sitting in Garrett's parking lot eating a gas station sandwich on a Tuesday afternoon when I got the voicemail. I almost didn't listen to it. It was from a number I didn't recognize, and I was tired enough that even lifting my phone felt like effort. But something, I don't know what, I've never been able to explain this, made me press play. The voice was old, careful. The kind of voice that chooses its words the way a carpenter chooses wood. This message is for Connor Hargrove. My name is Bernard Achterberg. I was a colleague of your father's some years ago, before he started the company. I have something that belongs to you. I'd ask that you call me back at your earliest convenience. It's rather important. I sat in that parking lot for a long time after the message ended. I almost didn't call back. I told myself it was probably nothing. Some old acquaintance of my dad's who wanted to express condolences, or pass along a piece of equipment, or tell me a story about the man I already knew better than anyone. I'd had a few of those calls. They were kind and they hurt, and I didn't know how to receive them. But the phrasing stuck with me. Something that belongs to you, not something of your father's. Something that belongs to you specifically. I called back. Bernard Achterberg answered on the second ring. He was careful on the phone the same way he'd been careful in the voicemail, measured, precise, not unkind. He told me that he and my father had worked together in the early days, before Hargrove Contracting existed, when my dad was doing subcontracting work for a larger outfit and Bernard was in project management. They'd stayed in loose contact over the years. When my dad got sick, he'd reached out to Bernard. He'd given him something to hold. He asked me to contact you after a certain amount of time had passed, Bernard said. He was specific about the timing. He didn't want anything handed over while things were still, his word, unsettled. What did he give you? I asked. A pause. I'd rather show you in person, if you don't mind the drive. Bernard lived outside a town called Bentley, about 40 minutes southwest of Red Deer. I drove out there the next morning on 2 cups of coffee and a feeling I couldn't name. His property was a quarter section, with a modest house and a shop that looked like it had been built by someone who knew what they were doing. He met me in the driveway, a man in his late 60s with the kind of handshake that means something, and he walked me inside without ceremony and set a metal lockbox on the kitchen table. He mailed this to me 8 months ago, Bernard said, before things got very bad. The box was the size of a shoebox, the kind used for storing important documents, and it was locked with a 4-digit combination. Bernard slid a piece of paper across the table, my dad's handwriting, the same blocky print he used on site plans. The combination was my birthday. I opened the box. Inside was a single key on a plain ring, a USB drive, and a folded letter in an envelope with my name on it. I looked at Bernard. He nodded once and stepped out of the kitchen to give me privacy. The letter was 3 pages, my dad's handwriting the whole way through, and I had to stop twice because I couldn't see clearly enough to read. He said he'd always known the marriage was harder on me than I let on. He said he was sorry he hadn't been better at talking about it. He said he was proud of the work I'd done for the company, prouder than he'd managed to tell me in the ways that counted. He said he'd made mistakes with the estate planning. He'd trusted people he shouldn't have trusted, moved too slowly on things he should have moved faster on, and he was trying, even now, even from wherever he was, to fix it. The key, he wrote, was to a property, not the house, not the yard, a different property, one he'd owned for 12 years that nobody knew about. He'd bought it early, paid cash, kept it out of every account and every filing that touched the business. It was in his personal name only. It was not part of the estate that had been declared. He gave me the address. He told me what I'd find there. And at the bottom of the last page, in handwriting that was a little shakier than the rest, I think he wrote this part near the end. He wrote, "I always trusted you to handle the truth, Connor. That's why I'm giving it to you now." The property was near a place called Caroline, a small community in the Foothills, about an hour and a half southwest of Red Deer, toward the mountains. I'd been through Caroline before. My dad and I used to drive that direction for fishing in the summers. But I hadn't known about any property. 12 years he'd owned it. I was 11 when he bought it. The drive out there was one of the stranger experiences of my life. It was early March by then, that uncertain Alberta season when the snow is pulling back but hasn't fully made up its mind, and the fields on either side of the highway were brown and pale and still. I kept thinking about my dad driving this same road. I kept trying to figure out why he'd bought a property out here and told nobody about it. The GPS took me off the highway onto a gravel road, then off the gravel onto a narrower track that wound through a stand of spruce trees before opening up to a small clearing. The property was maybe 5 acres, and sitting at the center of it was a cabin. Old but not falling down, the kind of structure that had been built by someone careful and maintained just enough to stay standing. Log walls, metal roof with a crease along one side where something, a branch, probably, had come down hard at some point. A front porch with 2 wooden chairs that had weathered gray. I sat in my truck for a minute just looking at it. I'd half expected the place to be wrecked. Broken windows, kicked-in door, the signs that someone had gotten there first. But it looked exactly like a cabin that had been locked up and left alone. Quiet in the way that undisturbed things are quiet. The key fit the front door lock on the first try. Inside smelled like cold wood and a faint trace of something, a candle maybe, or an old wool blanket. There was a wood stove, a kitchen table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the back room. On the kitchen table, positioned deliberately in the center, was a padlocked metal case, larger than the lockbox Bernard had given me. The kind of case you'd use for important documents or tools you didn't want damaged. Under the case was a sticky note in my dad's handwriting. It just said USB first. I sat down at the table, pulled out my laptop, and plugged in the USB drive. There were 2 folders. The first was labeled Documents. The second was labeled Watch Me. I opened Watch Me. It was a video. My dad, sitting in what I now recognized as this same kitchen, at this same table. He looked thinner than I remembered from even the year before. He was wearing a blue flannel shirt, and there was a coffee mug in front of him, and he looked directly at the camera with the focused, deliberate expression he used when he was explaining something important on a job site. "Hey, son," he said. "If you're watching this, you found the place. Good. Sit down and listen, because I've got a lot to tell you and I'm only going to say it once." I watched for 47 minutes. I watched it twice. My dad's story, the one he told in that video, was not a story I had known. It started 12 years ago, when the company was growing faster than he'd anticipated, and he'd needed capital to take on larger projects. He'd brought in a partner, a man named Douglas Sefton, a commercial real estate developer from Calgary who'd expressed interest in backing the right contractor. The deal had seemed straightforward. Sefton would put in capital, take a percentage of profits from specific projects, and exit cleanly when the projects wrapped. It didn't go cleanly. Over the following years, my dad described, Sefton had gradually inserted himself further into the company's financial structure. Small things at first. Routing payments through accounts my dad didn't fully control. Introducing a bookkeeper to help manage the growth, who turned out to be Sefton's nephew. By the time my dad understood what was happening, there were layers of documentation he couldn't easily untangle, and Sefton had made it quietly clear that untangling would be expensive, legally and otherwise. Then my dad met Diane. And Diane, it turned out, had known Douglas Sefton for years. "I don't know how much she knew when we got together," my dad said in the video, looking at the camera with something that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite anger. "I've gone back and forth on that more times than I can count. What I know is what happened after. What I know is what I found." What he found, in the last year before his diagnosis, was a parallel paper trail. Documents showing Sefton and Diane coordinating on the estate before my dad was even seriously ill. A will, not the will that had been filed, but a different one, drafted earlier, the one my dad had actually signed with his regular lawyer, had been replaced. He didn't know exactly when. He just knew that what he'd signed and what had been filed were not the same document, and his lawyer, the one he'd used for 15 years, had retired and relocated to Portugal in the months before my dad's health declined. The timing had not felt like coincidence. He'd tried to pursue it. He'd run into walls. He was sick and exhausted, and the legal process moved slowly, and the people around him had a vested interest in it moving slowly. So he'd done what he could do. He'd gathered everything, locked it in a case in a cabin nobody knew about, and trusted me to finish it. The Diegmans folder contained scanned copies of the original will, correspondence between Sefton and a Calgary law firm, bank records showing transfers my dad had flagged, a letter from Diane to Sefton dated 14 months before my dad's diagnosis that contained a sentence I read 3 times before my hands stopped shaking. Once things are settled on your end, we can move forward without the complications. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time after I closed the laptop. Outside the cabin window, the spruce trees were very still. The sky had gone the pale gray of late afternoon, and somewhere out in the trees a Canada jay was calling the same 3 notes over and over, patient and unhurried. I thought about my dad driving out here, carrying that case inside, sitting at this table, maybe in the same chair I was sitting in, thinking about what to do and how to do it and whether I'd actually find it. I thought, he trusted me to handle the truth. All right, I said out loud, to no one, let's go. I am not a lawyer. I want to be clear about that. I'm a guy who spent 4 years on job sites and 2 weeks on a friend's couch and 40 minutes watching a video his dead father left him in a cabin in the Alberta foothills. I had no idea how to do what needed to be done, but I knew how to find people who did. The first call I made was to my sister Nora. I drove back to the highway to get cell service, pulled over on the shoulder with the hazard lights on, and called her. She picked up on the first ring. She always picked up on the first ring. That was just Nora. And I said, I need you to listen to something. I drove to Edmonton that night. Nora had a friend from university who'd gone into estate law, a woman named Petra, who agreed to meet with us the following morning as a professional courtesy, no commitment, just to hear what we had. I sat in Petra's office with the USB drive and the printed documents I'd photographed on my phone and laid everything out as clearly as I could. Petra asked questions for an hour. She was the kind of lawyer who doesn't show much on her face, which I found reassuring. And she took notes in a small notebook with a precision that reminded me of my dad reading a set of blueprints. When I was done, she sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. This is not nothing, she said. I want to be straight with you about that. This is going to be a process. It's going to be expensive and slow, and there will be moments where it feels like nothing is happening. But what you have here is potentially significant. Nora and I looked at each other across the desk. What do we need to do? I asked. We started with the original will. Petra's office engaged a documents examiner. The filed will and the version on the USB showed differences in formatting and marginal spacing consistent with substitution, and the notarization on the filed document had issues under closer examination. It wasn't definitive on its own, but it was enough to file a formal challenge with the Alberta Court of King's Bench. While that was moving, slowly, as Petra had promised, we started building the financial picture. The bank records my dad had flagged were detailed enough that a forensic accountant could trace the movement of funds from Hargrove contracting accounts through a series of numbered companies, several of which had registered addresses at the same Calgary office that housed Douglas Sefton's development firm. It was not subtle once you knew where to look. It was the kind of thing that looks invisible until someone turns on the light, and then you wonder how you ever saw the room any other way. Sefton's role was harder to establish. He was careful, and he'd been careful for a long time. But the correspondence my dad had compiled included a thread of emails that had been forwarded to him by someone inside Sefton's organization. The emails had been anonymized, the source protected, that showed direct coordination on the will substitution. A paralegal at Sefton's law firm, when interviewed as part of the court-initiated investigation, eventually made a decision that I suspect she'd been building toward for a while. She cooperated. Diane knew, I think, from the moment the challenge was filed, that it was over. The evidence connecting her directly to the will fraud was thinner than what we had on Sefton. But it was there, and when things began to move, they moved faster than anyone anticipated. Her lawyer, a different firm from the one involved in the fraud, advised her, I imagine, that cooperation was her best option. She accepted a settlement that returned the estate assets to their proper distribution in exchange for reduced exposure on the fraud charges. She moved out of the house by June. Douglas Sefton did not cooperate. Douglas Sefton hired 3 lawyers and fought everything for 16 months. At the end of 16 months, he was convicted of 2 counts of fraud over $5,000 under the Criminal Code of Canada and sentenced to 4 years, with additional civil judgments that I understand have kept his legal team occupied since. The paralegal got a reduced sentence for her cooperation. She's out now, I'm told. I don't know what I feel about that, exactly. Some things don't have a clean answer. Hargrove Contracting, by the time everything was settled, had been through a period of significant disruption. Some of the employees had moved on. The equipment yard needed work. The reputation had held because reputations built over 22 years and rooted in actual work tend to hold even when the people around them don't. I had a decision to make. There's a moment, somewhere in all of that legal process, that I keep coming back to. It was a Thursday in October, almost 8 months after I'd driven out to the cabin in Caroline. I was in Petra's office for what felt like the 40th time, going over something in the financial documentation that needed clarification, and her assistant knocked on the door and said there was a call I should take. It was Bernard Achterberg. He'd been following the proceedings, he said, from a respectful distance. He'd given a statement when asked and otherwise stayed out of it, which was exactly what my dad had asked him to do. But he was calling now because he'd been thinking about something my father had said to him the last time they'd spoken. He thought I should know. He said he worried he hadn't given you enough, Bernard told me. Not the property, not the documents. He knew he'd sorted all that. He worried he hadn't given you enough of himself, enough conversations, enough time. I sat there in Petra's office with the phone against my ear and the afternoon light coming through the window, and I didn't say anything for a little while. He was wrong about that, I finally said. He gave me enough. I don't know if that's entirely true. I think grief is partly made of the conversations you never got to finish. But I said it, and I meant it in the ways that matter. I took the company back. That's the short version. The longer version involves Nora and me spending 3 months going through the books with our forensic accountant and the company's longtime site supervisor, a man named Archie, who'd been with Hargrove since the early days and who met with us in the boardroom on a Tuesday morning and said, plainly, that he'd stayed because he believed things would come right. Some of the former employees came back. Some didn't. We hired carefully. The cabin in Caroline I kept. The first weekend I went back out there after everything was resolved, I brought a box of my dad's books from the workshop, reference manuals, mostly, and a few novels he'd never mentioned liking, but had apparently read multiple times, and I put them on the shelf in the back room. I fixed the porch boards that had gone soft. I split some wood and stacked it along the south wall the way he would have done it, the way he'd taught me years ago, on a trip up north when I was maybe 9. I sat in one of those weathered chairs on the porch with a coffee and watched the spruce trees for a long time. The thing about grief, I've found, and I'm still in the middle of it, I don't think you're ever fully out of it, is that it doesn't go away when things get resolved. I thought it would, a little. I thought winning would make the loss smaller. It doesn't. What it does is give the loss a proper shape. My dad is gone, and that's the center of it, and everything else. The fraud and the fight and the years it cost, the company and the cabin and this porch and this coffee is just the country surrounding that center. You learn to live in it. The chair I was sitting in was the same one he would have sat in. He chose this property, chose this cabin, drove out here alone for 12 years, and I don't think it was only about hiding documents. I think he came here because it was quiet, and it was his, and no one needed anything from him here. I think he came here and sat on this porch and looked at those trees and just breathed for a while. I understand that now. I come out here most weekends in the summer. Sometimes Nora drives out, and we eat dinner on the porch and talk about him. The real conversations about him, not the careful ones you have in the first year when everything still feels fragile. I have a better sense now of who he was before he was my dad. The young man working subcontracting jobs in a strange city, the person who made mistakes and chose difficult people and tried, in the end, to make it right. My father was not a perfect man. He trusted the wrong people, and he moved too slow, and he carried burdens he should have shared earlier. He was also the person who drove out to a cabin in the Foothills and sat at a kitchen table and talked to a camera for 47 minutes because he believed, even at the end, that his son was capable of handling what came next. I think about that sentence from his letter a lot. I always trusted you to handle the truth, Connor. I kept it. I framed it. It hangs above the shelf where his books are. People sometimes ask me if I'm angry. At Diane, at Sefton, at the process, at the years. The honest answer is that I was for a long time very angry. There were months where it was the first thing I felt in the morning and the last thing I felt at night. But anger is like a fire in a wood stove. It'll warm you and it'll keep you moving, but you can't let it run the whole house forever. What I have now is something quieter. Stia dear, the company is growing again, slower and more carefully than before. The cabin is solid. Nora came out last month with her kids and we let them run around in the clearing while she and I sat on the porch and didn't talk much, which is one of the great underrated pleasures of having a sibling who's known you your whole life. My father built something real. He built it out of early mornings and frozen job sites and his own hands and his own stubbornness, and people tried to take it, and they almost succeeded, and they didn't. Neither did grief, neither did the garbage bag and the $340 and the couch that smelled like dog. I drove out to a cabin in the Foothills in March, and I opened a case at a kitchen table and I listened to my father's voice, and that was enough to change everything. Sometimes the thing that saves you has been waiting in a quiet place for a long time. Sometimes your father left it there on purpose. Sometimes you just have to make the drive.